In the slums of India, this poor young man couldn't afford a pen. But using small stones on the ground, he worked out an entire notebook full of mathematical formulas. He handed the formula to the academician of the society, hoping to make a living with his skills. But in India, these formulas were like nonsense, no one could understand them. He took his formulas everywhere looking for work, but faced rejection at every turn. Almost everyone thought he was crazy. Just as he was losing heart, the manager of a small factory recognized the value hidden in his notes, and agreed to give him an accounting job. There, Ramanujan's talent began to show its first glimmers. When the manager asked why he didn't use an abacus, he said mental calculation was faster. The manager did the math with an abacus and found he wasn't exaggerating at all. Only then did the manager realize that the man before him was no ordinary person. His talent should not be buried in the dust of ledgers. Since no one here cared about his formulas, he should leave India for the wider world. There, surely, there would be people who understood his gifts. This suggestion planted a seed of hope in Ramanujan's heart. So with the manager's help, Ramanujan sent his formulas to Professor Hardy at Cambridge. Upon seeing the densely packed mathematical formulas in the letter, Hardy was immediately stunned. The formulas looked wild, but when worked out, they turned out to be completely sound. The proof of any single one would shake the world. Hardy immediately wrote back to Ramanujan, inviting him to Cambridge to discuss academic matters. This was Ramanujan's one chance to change his fate. His wife and mother sold everything they could to scrape together money for a boat ticket. And so, alone, he traveled across the ocean and arrived at Cambridge. There was a rich intellectual atmosphere there, and even the apple tree that had famously bonked Newton on the head. Ramanujan excitedly stepped onto the grass, only to be shouted at and told to stop. Only fellows were allowed to walk on the grass, not an Indian commoner without a degree. The place embraced world literature, but it was also full of prejudice. The first time Ramanujan walked into the dining hall, his fellow students welcomed him warmly. Because his faith did not allow him to eat meat, a student kindly ordered a vegetarian potato dish for him. Only after he finished eating did they taunt him by saying the potatoes had been fried in lard. Prejudice does not come from ignorance, but from an arrogance of superiority. It is everywhere. Even in the halls of knowledge, it becomes an invisible wall that hinders true talent. And his collaboration with Hardy was also full of conflict. The next day, he handed the findings to Hardy. Looking at the impossibly thick stack of new formulas, Hardy and his colleague were completely bewildered. And to their further surprise, Ramanujan had another notebook full. But Hardy was a staunch atheist who believed in rigorous logic and proof. These formulas were just statements on paper. Without extensive verification, they could not be declared absolutely correct. Ramanujan, on the other hand, claimed that his formulas came from the goddess Namagiri. They were truths placed on his tongue by the divine. Hardy demanded that Ramanujan provide a rigorous proof for every single formula, or they could not be published. Ramanujan felt this was a waste of time. He knew the formulas were correct, but in order to publish the formula, and to verify it using a standardized process, still, he went to class. However, when the teacher turned around and saw that Ramanujan wasn't even taking notes, he flew into a rage and called him to the board to continue a calculation. To everyone's surprise, Ramanujan wrote the answer directly on the board. This humiliated the teacher, who had only solved half of it, and he lost his scholarly composure.
You don't pull a stunt like that in my class. You don't belong here, and you can tell your master Hardy I said as much. Now get out!
Ramanujan didn't understand what he had done wrong. He didn't understand why, if his formulas were correct, he had to rack his brains to prove them. But Professor Hardy answered him with two words: be humble. Humbly go back to class. Even a genius like Newton, back in the day, had to spend a great deal of time humbly proving his theories to the world. A great theory requires both a flash of genius and countless solid steps of logical reasoning. Hardy's demands seemed strict, but they were actually meant to protect the fruits of Ramanujan's genius, so that they could truly be accepted by the world. Enlightened, Ramanujan devoted himself to his studies. But before he could finish his proofs, World War broke out. British students were all conscripted, but Ramanujan, being Indian, was allowed to stay. This caused deep resentment among his fellow students. They beat him with their fists and feet. In those war-torn times, supplies were scarce. The vegetables he had painstakingly saved were trampled and destroyed. He dragged his battered body back to his dormitory. With no vegetarian food, he had to boil moldy leftovers to fill his stomach. Even the professors looked down on him, seeing an Indian scholar as a dirty outsider defiling their academic halls. They wanted to drive Ramanujan out of the college. But despite all the hardships, Ramanujan studied day and night, tirelessly. One day, he discovered a new function formula. Professor Hardy noticed that it was a type of function at which the head of the mathematics department excelled. Seizing the opportunity, Hardy introduced Ramanujan to him, hoping to silence the criticism. But the department head did not believe anyone could split functions with a formula. Yet moments later, Ramanujan used his formula to calculate a 13-digit result that had taken the department head a week to obtain.
3,972,998 million.
My God.
The head was stunned. The margin of error was less than 2%. He gained a new respect for Ramanujan. Hardy wanted to use this achievement to recommend Ramanujan for a fellowship, but he still couldn't shake the deep-seated prejudices of the Cambridge professors. The war was not over. The college had no vegetables. Ramanujan had to eat chalk dust to survive. Over time, one night, he collapsed with abdominal pain. He was diagnosed with advanced tuberculosis. His life was in God's hands. This news was like a zeppelin flying overhead, bombing the city to rubble, and crushing his strong heart. Ramanujan jumped from a train platform in London. Fortunately, a guard saw him in time and pulled him back from the brink of death. When Professor Hardy arrived at the hospital, he learned that Ramanujan was gravely ill. His heart was filled with regret and guilt. He realized that he had only cared about Ramanujan's formulas, never about his life. And this atheist prayed to God for the first time, begging him to save the life of this genius. The next day, Ramanujan woke up, pulled a new formula from his pocket, and handed it to Hardy. Even at death's door, he insisted that his formulas not be buried with him. But Hardy said, if you don't stay alive to prove them, you might as well take them to your grave. This time, however, Ramanujan had already provided full proofs. He was ready to die. To keep Ramanujan alive, Hardy resolved to win him a fellowship. If Cambridge wouldn't do it, he would bypass those old diehards and apply for the more prestigious Royal Fellowship. Hardy went all in. Beneath the gilded dome, he thundered, what the world discriminates against is not Ramanujan's skin or nationality, but the future of mathematics itself. It is this so-called Indian outsider who, in hunger and cold, has created one mathematical miracle after another, until he fell seriously ill. On what grounds do we doubt him? Then Hardy sat outside the door, waiting for the result. Thankfully, their efforts were not in vain. Ramanujan was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. Hardy rushed to tell him the good news, rekindling his will to live. A few days later, they walked into the grand hall together. As the fellows banged on the tables and chairs, Ramanujan placed his hand on the sacred book, and solemnly recited the oath.
I, Srinivas Ramanujan, elected Fellow of Trinity College.
At that moment, the genius who had been buried by prejudice finally tore through the academic hegemony's iron curtain. Ramanujan had once said, when success is achieved, it will be time to go home. Hardy came to the dock to see him off. Both came from humble families, and both, through their own efforts, managed to change the rigid academic atmosphere in Britain. They were mentor and student, but even more, kindred spirits. Ramanujan promised to return to England with his family within a year. Neither knew that this farewell would be forever. Soon after, Hardy received a letter from India. Fellow Ramanujan had suffered a relapse and sadly passed away. In that final year, he raced against time, burning through his last moments of life, leaving behind many important formulas for the world. 100 years later, those formulas would be used to understand the workings of black holes. From the slums to Cambridge, he crossed not only a physical distance, but also the towering walls of prejudice and hardship. He proved to the world that true talent will not be buried by origin, or by the discrimination of others. If you hold fast to your dreams, even in darkness, you can shine with a brilliant light.